So if someone is just tuning into the broadcast today, they're going to wonder what on earth is going on. If you get lost, wander around the church and just decide to stop up here. So yesterday about 5 o'clock, Joy called me and said that our guest preacher could not be here today. He had sick kids and several things going on. And initially we decided between the two of us, morning prayer is pretty complete. It doesn't really need a message. Then we hung up and left it at that. And a few minutes later, I thought, the internet. I Googled first Sunday in Lent, year B, and there probably are thousands of years. And various things, lots of different sermons. I wouldn't be comfortable giving a sermon. I'm not a theological anything. I plan services. I guess that's a bit of theology. But I certainly would not get up here and pretend to do a sermon as such. Although, I told Susan this, my great-grandmother Aurelia would be very pleased. My great-grandfather, George William Snell, was a ordained minister in the Church of Canada, which was an amalgamation of Methodists and Presbyterians and Congregationalists. And she was a very devout Methodist, I guess. I did meet her, but I was only in 3rd grade maybe. But I found out later that she was determined there would be some sort of legacy, someone that followed this great-grandfather. She gave up on her sons, and not only my grandmother, or my grandfather, her oldest son, that was probably a good idea. And went on then to grandsons, and I knew several of them too. And, well. So then she decided the oldest great-grandson, which is me. And didn't quite do that, but I've been on the church staff for nearly 50 years now as a musician, so whatever. Yeah, sure. So at any rate, I did some searching. First of all, I had to find words I was comfortable with, and I came across this a reflection as such, meditation written by a Jesuit priest who's out in Montana somewhere, and he writes a weekly article on the Sunday lessons for a Jesuit publication called America. So this is his thoughts on the first Sunday in Lent. For the biblical readings of the Sundays of Lent, the Church chose texts that offer many layers of interpretation. Some readings have themes that will continue throughout the readings of subsequent weeks, while on other Sundays, each reading will contribute in some way to an overall motive or idea for that particular day. For example, this Sunday's readings begin with the idea of a covenant between God and humanity. This theme will continue next week when we read about God's covenant with Abraham. But the readings of this Sunday have their own depth and insight of their own. Accounts of the covenant have certain elements that are significant in themselves, especially the sign of the covenant that God offers humanity. Biblical authors also found spiritual significance in elements that do not relate to the covenant, like the natural setting and the characters of the narrative. As the readings draw these themes and motives together, we can hear the deeper internal conversations within the Bible. It is from these conversations that the Church's spiritual and theological traditions come forth. Consider the dramatic opening scene from this Sunday's first reading. The floods recede, and God establishes a new ecology on the earth, and a new covenant with Noah and his sons. To begin Lent with a reminder of God's original pledge to humanity prompts us to deepen our own understandings of the unique covenant God has made with each of us. Biblical covenants exist because of God's initiative. They do not depend on humans to remain faithful. Humans may fail in their obligations, but God always sustains the relationship. God's covenant is mentioned explicitly 5 times in this Sunday's reading. covenant has a sign, a symbol, that will remind future generations of God's fidelity. I have set my bow in the clouds, God says, and to serve as a sign of the covenant between me and the earth. The presence of a rainbow during or after a storm can be a hauntingly poetic and beautiful portent of clear skies to come. God chose this beautiful image from nature as a perpetual reminder of divine presence on earth. The power of this sign paints the image and promise indelibly on the reader's mind. It is a work of art that draws a person of faith even more deeply into reflection on its meaning. The very point of such a sign is to give rise to reflection. The strongest covenants are those that are renewed over and over again. This Sunday's gospel, while short and very different in setting, provides its own reflections on these covenantal themes. In contrast to Noah's flood, Jesus begins his ministry in the driest of places. At once the Spirit drove him into the desert. Deserts and open water share an important characteristic. Each presents a vast horizon that can evoke the question, where do we go from here? In Scripture, the desert is the place one faces existential realities. The desert can be a metaphor for many things, but foremost, it is a setting of testing. In this, it is an apt symbol for Lent, a time for testing for which the exam question is clear. How is our covenant with God going so far? At first glance, this Sunday's second reading from the first letter of Peter might leave one with more questions than answers. The sacred author describes Jesus as someone who, after his death, speaks to the spirits in prison, who had once been disobedient while God patiently waited in the days of Noah. This reflection draws together material from the story of Nephilim, where the Noah saga, and traditions from outside of the biblical canon, such as those preserved in the book of Enoch. The sacred author comes to understand Noah's flood and these other interpretations that traditions as events that interpret the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. This prefigured baptism which saves you now, not as a removal of dirt from the body, but an appeal to God for a clear conscience through the resurrection of Jesus Christ. This is a good example of early Christian author reflecting on Scripture and tradition to understand the experience of the living Christ. For disciples today, this is a good example of the Bible thinking about its own thinking, or drawing its readers ever deeper into the mystery of God. This Sunday's readings are a reminder to begin Lent with a reflective conversation with God as a way to renew our own covenant. Lent is not the removal of dirt from our lives, as much as it is a way to approach God with a clear conscience, trusting that Jesus' resurrection already establishes our covenant on solid ground, safe from any potential flood. So I hope there's some thoughts in there that you found meaningful, and I'll invite you to stand for the Apostles' Creed.